or even the fragile hope tucked inside every line I scribbled, but the kind of weight that presses against your chest and makes breathing feel like dragging rocks through your lungs. People think grief is loud, that it's about crying in bathrooms or screaming into pillows, but for me, grief was silence. A silence so heavy that it swallowed every part of my life, until I almost forgot what it felt like to be seen. When my mother was alive, everything in our small house seemed brighter, fuller, touched with a warmth that I never truly noticed until it was gone. She had this way of filling a room without speaking, of turning the ordinary into something worth remembering. The smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, the hum of her voice while folding laundry, the way she would pause in the middle of a chore just to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I didn't realize how much those tiny gestures held me together until they were ripped away all at once. After she was gone, the walls of the house stood still, the floors creaked like they were mourning with me, and the silence screamed louder than any words could. School became a blur, not because I stopped learning, but because I stopped existing. Teachers called my name but never looked me in the eye. Classmates whispered but never spoke to me directly, and day after day I drifted through the hallways like a ghost in sneakers. I wasn't invisible because people couldn't see me. I was invisible because they chose not to. No one wanted to be reminded of loss, of absence, of what it meant when a family broke in half, so they looked past me, as though ignoring me might erase the truth. At home, things weren't any better. My father tried in his own way, I think, but grief had turned him into someone else, someone who worked too late and spoke too little, a man who stared at the television like it might explain what words could not. Our dinners shrank into silence, forks scraping plates in a rhythm that only reminded me of everything missing. Sometimes I wanted to scream just to see if he'd notice, but the sound stayed locked in my throat. I told myself that maybe silence was safer, that if I didn't speak, I wouldn't break. But at night, when the house was still and the shadows stretched across my bedroom walls, the ache became unbearable. I'd lie awake, replaying memories, her laugh echoing across the kitchen, the warmth of her hugs after a bad day, the way she always knew the right words before I even asked the question. Those memories weren't comforting. They were daggers, sharp reminders of what I'd lost, and the more I clung to them, the emptier I felt. It was on one of those nights, when the loneliness felt heavier than my body could hold, that the idea came to me. I sat up in bed, grabbed the notebook I used for school assignments, and tore out a clean sheet. My hands trembled as I held the pen, not because I didn't know what to write, but because I was terrified of how much I needed to. The words spilled out before I could stop them. Simple, childlike, but loaded with every ache I'd carried for months. I miss you, Mom. I stared at those 4 words until the ink blurred through my tears. It felt ridiculous, writing to someone who would never read it, but at the same time it felt necessary, like the only way to keep her from fading completely. I wanted her to know, somehow, that I hadn't moved on, that I hadn't forgotten, that her absence was not just an empty chair at the dinner table, but a hole in the center of my world. The question then became, where do I leave it? Keeping it in my room felt pointless, like whispering into a locked box, so I slipped into my shoes, wrapped myself in a sweater, and crept outside, into the night air. The sky was overcast, the moon smudged behind thick clouds, and the streetlights buzzed faintly as I walked down the familiar path toward the small cemetery at the edge of town. My legs carried me on instinct. I had been there so many times since the funeral that the route felt carved into my bones. When I reached her grave, I hesitated. The grass was damp with dew, the headstone cold and unyielding beneath my fingertips. I knelt down, folded the note carefully, and placed it at the base of the stone, tucking it just beneath the edge so the wind wouldn't carry it away. My chest tightened as I whispered into the night, "I miss you too much, Mom. Please, don't forget me." The words dissolved into the darkness, swallowed by the silence that always seemed to linger here, and I knew no reply would come. But leaving the note behind gave me the tiniest sliver of peace, as though I had handed my pain to someone who understood, even if only in spirit. Walking back home, I told myself it was just a ritual, something private to soothe the emptiness. I didn't expect magic. I didn't expect miracles. I didn't expect anything at all, really. That note wasn't meant to be answered. It wasn't meant to change anything. It was simply a thread connecting me to a past I couldn't let go of, a fragile attempt to feel like my mom was still listening somewhere, somehow. When I crawled back into bed, I pressed my face into the pillow and tried to believe that writing was enough, that even if no one ever saw those words, they carried weight because I had dared to say them out loud. I closed my eyes and whispered one last goodnight, imagining her voice answering back in the way it used to. For the first time in months, I fell asleep with tears on my face but without the usual hollowness in my chest. But the morning shattered that fragile sense of peace. When I returned to the cemetery the next day, just to check, just to reassure myself that the note was still there, I froze. The paper I had left at her grave, the one I had tucked so carefully beneath the headstone, was gone. The note had vanished, and I didn't yet know that someone had answered it. Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone isn't the silence, it's learning to live in it. The days after my mother's death didn't arrive in waves like people said grief would. They didn't crash and recede, giving me moments of rest between storms. Instead, they stretched into long, unbroken plains of emptiness where time lost its edges. Morning bled into afternoon, afternoon into night, and every hour felt the same, marked only by the constant reminder of what wasn't there anymore. The house that had once been warm and chaotic, filled with the smell of her cooking and the sound of her humming, became a hollow shell echoing with my footsteps and the ache of her absence. The silence was unbearable, not just the silence of a room without conversation, but the silence of missing habits, missing laughter, missing love. The television stayed off most nights, because it only reminded me of the evenings when she and I would sit curled together under a blanket, whispering commentary over whatever show was on. The kitchen became a place I avoided, because the smell of spices and simmering soup had been replaced with the sterile scent of untouched counters. Even my bedroom felt different. The walls were the same color, the window still framed the same patch of sky, but without her voice telling me good night, the space felt foreign, like I was living in someone else's home. At school, the loneliness sharpened into something more visible. People didn't know how to act around me, and so they didn't act at all. Friends who once filled my days with chatter began speaking in hushed tones whenever I approached. Teachers avoided looking directly into my eyes, as though seeing me might remind them of their own worst fears. I became a walking reminder of loss, a fragile mirror of what they could not bear to imagine for themselves. Their silence cut deeper than their words ever could have, because it wasn't rejection I felt, but erasure. I wasn't teased, I wasn't confronted, I wasn't included, I simply wasn't. Every day I carried the weight of absence like a shadow that no light could lift. I longed for her voice most of all, that soft cadence she used when she explained the world to me. She never made me feel foolish for asking questions, never dismissed my fears, never let me doubt that I mattered. Now, when I stumbled over homework problems or stared at my reflection with tears in my eyes, there was no one to tell me it would be okay. I longed for her touch, too. The way her arms wrapped around me could undo any pain the world inflicted. The way her fingers brushed through my hair made me feel safe in ways words couldn't. I craved her advice, her steady presence that made the chaos of life seem navigable, and without it, I felt like a ship drifting, without an anchor, without a map, without a destination. Even in sleep, she haunted me. Sometimes I dreamed of her, not as a ghost, but as the mother I remembered laughing, alive, calling my name from the kitchen. I would wake in the middle of the night with my heart pounding, the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears, only to realize it was just my mind playing cruel tricks. Those moments were the hardest, because for a brief second I believed she was still here, only to lose her all over again. In the emptiness, I clung to the one thing that gave me even the faintest comfort, the notes. That first night, when I left behind the scrap of paper scrawled with, "I miss you, Mom," something inside me shifted. I didn't expect her to answer, but writing those words and leaving them where she rested made me feel like I had opened a doorway, however fragile, between my world and hers. It was as if the act of putting ink to paper kept her memory alive in a way that silence never could. So I wrote again. Not every night, but often enough that it became a ritual. I told her about school, about the way people treated me, about the meals I skipped because I couldn't stand sitting at the table without her. I told her about the nights I couldn't sleep, about the dreams that teased me with her presence, about the mornings that felt heavier than they should. Sometimes I wrote questions, though I knew they'd never be answered. Did she still watch over me? Was she proud of me? Did she know how much I missed her? The questions lived on paper because they had nowhere else to go, and even if no reply ever came, the act of asking made me feel like I was still connected to her somehow. I would fold each note carefully, almost reverently, as though the words themselves carried a sacred weight. I placed them at her grave, or tucked them into the hollow of an old oak tree near the cemetery fence, a secret place only I knew. Each time I left a note, I whispered a few words aloud, my voice shaky but determined, hoping the wind would carry them to wherever she was. It was foolish, maybe, but it was all I had. Days turned into weeks, and the ritual became my lifeline. Writing kept me from collapsing entirely, gave me purpose when nothing else did. I didn't expect anyone to read the notes, didn't even think about the possibility. They were meant for her and her alone, even if I knew logically she could never hold them in her hands. In my mind, they were like prayers spoken into the void, but offering a kind of solace just by being said. Then came the day everything changed. It was late autumn, the kind of day when the air bit at my skin and the sky seemed permanently gray. I had written another letter the night before, longer than usual, pouring out every ache I had bottled up, how much I missed her hugs, how invisible I felt at school, how I feared I was becoming someone she wouldn't even recognize anymore. Leaving it at her grave, I whispered good night and walked away as I always did, expecting nothing in return. But when I came back the next afternoon, my breath caught in my throat. The folded paper wasn't where I had left it. It wasn't damp from the morning dew. It wasn't lying half buried in grass. It was gone, completely gone, and in its place was a reply. Imagine pouring your heart into a letter and finding someone had written back. When I walked toward the cemetery that afternoon, my steps dragged with the familiar heaviness that had settled into my bones since my mother's death. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, because nothing in my life had been unusual for months. Everything was predictable in the worst way: the silence of my house, the stares at school, the way each note I left felt like a tiny whisper into a void that would never answer. I carried no hope, no anticipation, only the dull routine of returning to the place where I always left my folded pieces of grief. But that day, the routine cracked open in a way I never thought possible. The first thing I noticed was the absence. The paper I had folded so carefully the night before, the one where I had confessed more than I had ever dared to say aloud, was gone. My chest tightened, and I froze at the foot of my mother's grave, scanning the grass as if maybe the wind had carried it away, or rain had soaked it into the soil. My hands trembled as I bent down, moving small stones and blades of grass, searching for even a corner of white that might reassure me that it hadn't simply disappeared. But it was nowhere. For the first time since I started leaving the notes, one of them was missing. Confusion wrestled with fear inside me. Who would take it? Why? These notes weren't meant for anyone else, weren't meant to be touched by strangers or handled by curious hands. They were mine, my rawest feelings, my most fragile pieces of truth meant only for the mother I had lost. Anger pricked at me, but beneath it was something far more dangerous: hope. Because when I straightened up and looked again, I saw something resting neatly against the base of the headstone. It was a folded piece of paper. Not mine. Not in the same rushed handwriting of my confessions. This paper was creased differently, folded with care into a clean rectangle, and my pulse quickened as I reached for it. My fingers shook as I unfolded it, and when my eyes traced the words, the world tilted beneath me. She misses you too. Keep writing. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred with tears that came so fast I didn't even have time to wipe them away. The words seemed impossible, and yet there they were, inked clearly in handwriting that wasn't mine. I read them once, Then again, as though repetition might explain the impossibility of what I was seeing. She misses you too. Those 4 words carved straight through my chest, because they were exactly what I had longed to hear since the moment she was gone. It felt magical, surreal, like the universe had cracked open and allowed something extraordinary to bleed into my ordinary misery. My heart screamed to believe it was her, that somehow, impossibly, my mother had reached across the divide to let me know I wasn't alone, that she still thought of me, that our bond hadn't been severed by death. I wanted to believe it with every fiber of my being, because the alternative that someone else had written this carried questions I wasn't ready to face. I traced the handwriting with my fingertip. It was neat but unfamiliar, not the looping, flowing script of my mother's grocery lists or the quick notes she used to leave on the fridge. This was different, steadier, almost formal, and yet the words themselves held such gentleness that I could almost trick myself into believing they belonged to her anyway. My mind spun with possibilities. Could my father have found the note and decided to answer in her place, knowing how desperately I needed comfort? Could a stranger have stumbled across it and, out of pity, written a reply to keep me from despairing? Every possibility seemed absurd, but none more absurd than the one I wanted most, that it was truly her, reaching out to me. I clutched the note to my chest, torn between fear and wonder. If it was someone else, then they knew things they shouldn't. They had read my words, my secrets, my confessions. They had crossed a line into the most sacred space I had created for myself. But if it was her, if it was somehow her, then everything I thought I knew about death, about silence, about loneliness, might not be true. As I walked home, the paper crumpled in my trembling hands. I kept glancing down at it, reading the words over and over until they etched themselves into me. She misses you too. Keep writing. It was a command and a comfort all at once, a promise and a plea. And though the handwriting was different, the effect was undeniable. I no longer felt quite as invisible as I had the day before. That night, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with the note beside me, the words burning into my mind like a secret flame I couldn't let go of. Who had written them? How had they known what to say? And why did it feel so much like my mother's voice, even though the penmanship told me otherwise? My brain spun in circles, logic wrestling against longing, reason fighting against faith. I wanted to demand answers, but I was also terrified of breaking whatever fragile magic had just entered my life. When the house fell quiet, I pulled out another piece of paper. My pen hovered over the blank sheet, hesitating, unsure of what to write, until finally the words poured out in a rush. I told her, or whoever it was, how much those words had meant to me, how I had felt like I was sinking every day without her, how the reply had pulled me back from the edge in ways I couldn't explain. I didn't ask questions, not yet. I didn't accuse or doubt. I simply wrote with trembling honesty, hoping that whoever had answered would do so again. I folded the paper with care, almost ritualistically, and the next morning I returned to the grave, placing it exactly where the last one had been. I whispered into the cold morning air, "Please, answer again," and walked away with my heart pounding in my chest. The hours that followed crawled by in unbearable slowness. At school, I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on the droning of teachers or the chatter of classmates. All I could think about was the possibility waiting for me at the cemetery. My mind played out scenarios like a film reel, the note being gone, the note being answered, the note lying untouched in mocking silence. Each possibility carried its own weight, but only one mattered: the chance that whoever had written back would continue. When the final bell rang, I bolted from the classroom, my feet carrying me faster than they ever had, my breath short with anticipation. By the time I reached the cemetery, the sky was painted with streaks of fading sunlight, and my heart thudded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I slowed as I approached the grave, my eyes scanning the spot where I had left the folded paper. My chest tightened, my throat dry, as I saw that once again, the paper wasn't where I had placed it. It had been moved, opened, answered. With trembling fingers I picked it up, unfolding it with both dread and hope. At the bottom of the page, beneath my own words, a short response was scrawled in that same, steady, unfamiliar handwriting. And for the first time, there was a name attached. It was signed only as a friend. What if a stranger's words felt closer to your heart than your own family? After the first reply signed a friend, I found myself caught in a strange rhythm, one that felt both dangerous and healing at the same time. Each night, I wrote, sometimes only a few sentences, sometimes pages filled with every raw and unfiltered thought I had been carrying. I wrote about the loneliness that crept through me like poison, about the moments when silence pressed so hard on my chest that I thought I would shatter beneath it, about the way I felt invisible not only at school but also in my own home. I confessed things I had never dared to say aloud. The bitterness I felt when I saw other children laughing with their mothers, the fear that I was slowly forgetting the sound of her voice, the anger that sometimes rose in me when I thought about how unfair it all was. And every morning or afternoon, when I returned to the place where I left my folded letters, there was always an answer waiting. The replies were never long, never overflowing with detail, but they carried a weight that my words alone could not hold. They were gentle, soothing, wise in ways that made me feel like I was being guided rather than pitied. Whoever this friend was, they wrote with the same kind of tenderness my mother once carried in her voice, a softness that made even the harshest truths easier to hold. Sometimes the replies offered comfort, "You are stronger than you think." Other times they offered quiet wisdom. Grief doesn't vanish, it transforms. And sometimes they were simply acknowledgments that I had been heard. I understand. Keep writing. Those words became lifelines, tiny threads that pulled me back each time I felt like falling further into the abyss. Days blurred into weeks, and those folded scraps of paper became the closest thing I had to conversation. At school, I still walked the hallways like a shadow, unnoticed and unwanted, but in my letters I was seen. At home, the silence with my father stretched on, heavy and unbroken, but on those pages I was answered. For the first time since my mother's death, I didn't feel completely alone. It was as though someone, somewhere, cared enough to step into the darkness with me, even if only through ink and paper. I began to wonder about the person behind the words. Was it someone who had known my mother? Was it a stranger who stumbled upon my notes and felt compelled to answer? Was it possible that the veil between worlds was thinner than I thought, and that somehow, in ways I couldn't explain, my mother herself was reaching through? Logic told me no, but my heart begged me to believe yes. And with every reply, the line between reality and hope grew harder to distinguish. There were nights I sat awake in bed, the newest letter clutched to my chest, rereading it until the words blurred into each other. I studied the handwriting, neat but not flawless, steady but not mechanical, searching for familiarity in every curve of ink. It didn't match my mother's hand, yet the voice behind it often felt so uncannily like her that it made my throat tighten. Could a stranger possibly know how to answer me in ways that mirrored her so closely? Could they have guessed the exact words I needed to hear? Or was there something more? The more I wrote, the braver I became. I started asking questions, not just pouring out grief. I asked what my mom might say if she saw how invisible I felt now, what advice she'd give about surviving each day, whether she believed I could ever feel normal again. The replies were careful, never over-promising, never dismissing my pain. They didn't claim to be her, yet they didn't deny it either. Instead, they carried the essence of what she might have said: "You are not invisible. The world just hasn't learned to see you again yet." Or, "Normal doesn't mean the same. Normal means you will find a new way of being whole." These words became mantras I whispered to myself in the quiet hours, fragile shields against the despair that still tried to pull me under. The ritual became sacred to me. Writing was no longer just an outlet. It was a bridge. Each letter felt like stepping onto a path that led somewhere I couldn't yet see, but trusted anyway. And though I didn't know who waited on the other side, I began to cherish their presence more than anything else in my life. I guarded the secret fiercely, terrified that if anyone else knew, it would vanish. My father never asked where I went each evening, and I never told him. My teachers saw me scribbling during lunch breaks, but they assumed it was homework or doodles. No one knew that I was carrying on a correspondence with a phantom, a stranger, an angel, or perhaps my mother herself. And then came the reply that made my heart stop. It was an ordinary day, nothing unusual in the air or the sky. I had left a note the night before, writing about a dream I had, one where my mother stood in the kitchen humming, the smell of pancakes filling the room, her hair tied back with a ribbon that always slipped loose. I told this friend how painful it was to wake from such dreams, how cruel it felt to be given a glimpse of her only to lose her all over again. I folded the paper with my usual care, tucked it in its place, and walked away with the usual mix of sorrow and hope. When I returned the next afternoon, I found the reply waiting. I unfolded it quickly, expecting the same gentle reassurances, the same soft wisdom. But as my eyes skimmed the page, my breath caught in my throat. The reply described that exact ribbon, not just any ribbon, but the faded blue one my mother used to wear almost every morning. It mentioned how she would tie it in a quick knot, how strands of hair would always slip free no matter how tightly she pulled it back. My hands shook violently as I read the words again, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't a detail I had written in my note. I had only mentioned the dream, not the ribbon, not the color, not the way it never stayed in place. There was no way a stranger could have known that. No way anyone could have guessed something so specific, so intimate, so deeply rooted in memory. I stared at the page, my body frozen between terror and wonder. If this was only a stranger, then how had they known? If it was more than that, if it was truly her, then everything I thought I understood about life and death was about to unravel. Because in that moment, with ink staring back at me, I realized this friend knew things only my mother ever could. When hope whispers it might be real, but logic screams it can't be. Which voice do you follow? The note about the ribbon haunted me in ways I couldn't put into words. For hours I held that paper in my hands, my eyes drawn back again and again to the lines that described something no one else could have possibly known. I had told the friend about my dream, but not about the ribbon, not about the way it always slipped loose, not about the shade of blue that had dulled over years of use. That detail was mine and my mother's alone, tucked away in the private corners of memory. To see it written there, in someone else's hand, felt like a door creaking open between two worlds. One I had longed to reach, and one I had convinced myself was forever locked. The surge of hope that rose inside me was almost unbearable. What if it really was her? What if my mother had somehow found a way back to me, not in flesh and voice, but in ink and paper? I could feel her presence in those words, the gentle cadence of her voice stitched between the lines. I could almost see her at the kitchen counter, ribbon tied, humming absent-mindedly while she cooked. Every fiber of me wanted to believe this was her, reaching out, letting me know she had not disappeared completely. But logic dug in its heels. It reminded me of all the things I knew about life and death, about how people don't come back, about how the grave is an ending no pen can undo. Logic whispered that it was impossible, that the ribbon detail was a coincidence, that someone was playing a cruel trick. My heart rebelled against those whispers, but my mind clung to them out of fear of being fooled, fear of building hope only to have it ripped away again, fear of discovering that the one fragile comfort I had found was built on lies. For days, I lived in that battle. In one moment, I would hold the letter close, letting myself believe, allowing warmth to spread through me, as if my mother's hand had brushed mine. In the next, I would shove it into my drawer, furious with myself for being so naive, for daring to imagine that something so extraordinary could happen to someone like me. My emotions tore me apart, dragging me between two truths, one I desperately wanted and one I dreaded was real. I remembered little moments, tiny fragments of memory that belonged only to us. The way she would twist that ribbon in her hair while standing at the sink. The way she always tapped her spoon against the edge of the pot 3 times before tasting the food. The way she called me by a nickname no one else ever used, A name so silly it always made me roll my eyes but secretly warmed me inside. These were details etched deep into me, parts of my mother that no one else had ever witnessed closely enough to remember. And now, in these letters, pieces of those details were surfacing. How could that be if it wasn't her? How could a stranger know the private language of my memories? At night, lying in bed, I would hear two voices. One was my mother's, gentle and reassuring, telling me she was still with me, urging me to keep writing, to trust. The other was colder, harsher, insisting that I was only setting myself up for heartbreak, that I was nothing more than a fool clinging to shadows. I would turn from side to side beneath my blanket, tears burning my eyes, caught between wanting to believe and being terrified of what belief might cost me. Even at school, the war raged inside me. I sat through classes unable to hear the teacher, unable to see the words on the board. My mind wandered constantly back to the grave, to the folded notes waiting like silent messengers, to the possibility that I was communicating with the impossible. My classmates saw only my silence, my distance, but none of them knew the storm that lived beneath it. None of them knew that every breath I took was filled with equal parts dread and longing. My father noticed something too, though he never asked outright. He would glance at me over dinner, his brow furrowing as if he wanted to speak, but then he would lower his gaze again and chew in silence. Maybe he saw the letters in my eyes, the way they kept me awake, the way they weighed on me. Maybe he suspected but didn't dare to ask, afraid of what the answer might be. Or maybe he had retreated so far into his own grief that he couldn't reach into mine. The letters continued, and each reply pushed me further into the dangerous balance between hope and fear. The friend wrote with such care, such patience, such uncanny familiarity, that I couldn't help but feel tethered to them, whoever they were. They never claimed to be my mother, but they never denied it either. Instead, they wrote as though they knew me, in ways no one else did, reflecting back pieces of my life that I had only ever shared with her. One night, after hours of tossing and turning, I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and sat at my desk with my pen poised above it. My hands shook, my chest ached, and my mind screamed at me not to do it, not to ask what I was about to ask. But the question had been burning in me too long to keep it caged. I needed to know. I needed to break the silence that lived between the lines of every letter. I began to write, slowly at first, my words spilling across the page like a confession. I told them how much their replies had meant to me, how they had given me a lifeline when I was drowning. I admitted the battle inside me, my desperate hope that it was my mother, my crushing fear that it wasn't. I confessed that I didn't know how much longer I could survive without the truth. And then, with trembling fingers and a heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst, I wrote the words that terrified me most. "Are you really my mom?" I stared at the sentence, the ink still wet, my vision blurred by tears. The question sat there on the page like a bomb waiting to detonate, like a doorway I couldn't step back from once opened. I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking so badly that the edges didn't align, and when I placed it at the grave that night, I whispered into the darkness, "Please, please be her." The letter was gone by morning, carrying my most dangerous question into the hands of someone I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Sometimes truth hides inside a story you thought only one person knew. The morning after I left that question, "Are you really my mom?" I felt sick to my stomach. I could barely drag myself out of bed, every bone in my body heavy with dread. I knew what I had done. I had broken the fragile balance of our secret correspondence, shattered the unspoken rules by asking the one question that could not be taken back. I had exposed my deepest hope and my greatest fear in just 6 words, and now I had to face whatever answer would come. All day at school, my body buzzed with nervous energy. I could not focus on lessons, could not eat at lunch, could not hear the chatter around me. Every second stretched unbearably long, each tick of the clock a reminder that a reply might already be waiting for me in the place where I had left my folded confession. By the time the last bell rang, my palms were damp with sweat, my heart racing so fast I felt dizzy. I ran the familiar path to the cemetery, every step carrying me closer to either salvation or devastation. When I reached her grave, my breath caught. There it was, a folded paper, waiting neatly in the place where mine had been. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe, terrified of what might be inside. Finally, with trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. The reply was longer this time. My eyes scanned the lines, my chest tightening with each word. It didn't begin with a yes or a no. It didn't answer my question directly at all. Instead, it began with a story. Once, when you were very small, you had a terrible fever, it read. You were restless and frightened, crying for hours, and nothing seemed to comfort you. Your mother sat by your bed the whole night, humming a song she said her own mother used to sing to her. It wasn't a lullaby from any book or radio, it was just a tune she carried in her heart. You fell asleep, clutching her hand, your face pressed against her arm, and when you woke, the fever had broken. She never forgot that night, because she said it was the moment she realized how strong you were, even as a child. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the paper. That story was real. I remembered it not in detail, but in pieces, fragments my mind had stored away. The vague memory of a song hummed in the dark, the sensation of my mother's hand pressed against mine, the warmth of her presence when I thought the sickness might swallow me whole. It was a story she had told me once, years later, as we sat on the couch, her fingers brushing through my hair, while she reminded me how brave I had been. No one else had been there. No one else could have known. Tears blurred my vision as I reread the words, my heart thundering in my chest. Was this proof? Was this the confirmation I had begged for? The handwriting still didn't match hers, yet the memory was so precise, so intimate, so utterly impossible for a stranger to invent, that my soul ached with belief. The reply continued. Your mother wanted you to know that strength is still inside you, even when it feels buried. She wanted you to believe that you carry her courage, her love, her resilience in every step you take. Keep writing. She hears you. I pressed the page against my chest, sobbing openly in the stillness of the cemetery. Logic screamed at me that this was impossible, that someone was manipulating me, that grief was clouding my judgment. But my heart, my breaking, desperate heart, whispered that this was real, that my mother had reached through the impossible and touched me again. For days afterward, I lived in a haze of conflicting emotions. Every time I held that letter, warmth surged through me, a fragile thread of hope that maybe I was not as alone as I believed. But then doubt would creep in like a shadow, whispering cruel possibilities. What if someone had overheard my mother tell me that story years ago? What if my father, in some hidden attempt to help, had been writing the replies? What if this entire thing was a cruel trick, designed to comfort me with lies? I wanted to ask, wanted to demand clarity, but fear held me back. If I pushed too hard, would the answers stop? If I forced the truth, would I lose the one lifeline that was keeping me afloat? I decided to keep writing, to keep playing along, because even if it was only a stranger, even if it was only a lie, the comfort was real enough to cling to. The letters continued. I poured myself into them with even greater intensity now, desperate to hold on to whatever magic lingered between the pages. I told a friend things I had never said to anyone about the guilt I felt, wondering if I had been a good enough daughter, about the nights I prayed for her voice to return, about the crushing weight of trying to live in a world that felt colder every day. And always, the replies came back with patience and care, reminding me to breathe, to endure, to believe. And yet, beneath the comfort, questions festered. Who was this friend? Why had they chosen me? How could they know the things they knew? Each reply both soothed and unsettled me, as though I were walking a tightrope suspended between faith and fear, one step away from falling into madness. One evening, as the sun sank and the sky bled orange into gray, I sat with a blank sheet of paper before me. My pen hovered, my mind torn. Part of me wanted to accept the magic as it was, to stop asking questions and simply be grateful. But another part of me burned with the need to know, the need to tear away the veil of mystery and look at the truth, however painful it might be. That night, I wrote more carefully than ever before. My words were heavy, deliberate, a plea as much as a question. I told a friend that their letters had changed me, that they had given me something to hold on to when I thought I had nothing left. I thanked them for every word, for every moment of comfort, for every glimpse of my mother's love reflected back to me. And then, with my breath catching in my throat, I wrote the question that had been burning in me since the ribbon letter, since the fever story, since the impossible details had begun to surface. How do you know these things? I folded the paper slowly, almost reverently, and placed it at her grave. My heart hammered as I whispered into the night, "Please, just tell me the truth." The next reply didn't explain how it simply ended with 4 words that made my blood run cold. Because I was there. What would you do if your invisible friend suddenly had a face? By the time I received the reply that ended with the chilling words, "Because I was there," sleep became impossible. I lay awake for nights, clutching the letter in my trembling hands, staring at the ceiling as questions tore me apart. Who was this person? How could they have been present in those moments I thought belonged only to my mother and me? Were they family? A neighbor? Some long-forgotten acquaintance? Or was it something stranger, something beyond what reason could explain? The uncertainty gnawed at me until I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't breathe without hearing those 4 words echo in my mind. I knew I couldn't continue living in that state of half-belief, half-dread. Each letter drew me deeper into a mystery that seemed less like comfort and more like a trap, and yet I couldn't stop. I was too far in now. I needed to see. I needed to know. So I devised a plan. The next evening, with my heart hammering like a drum in my chest, I wrote a short note, not a confession, not a plea, just a simple line. "I'm still here." It was bait, a lure designed to draw them out. I folded it carefully, just as I always did, and placed it at the base of my mother's headstone. But this time, I didn't walk away. Instead, I slipped into the shadows of a nearby oak tree, crouching low in the tall grass, my breath shallow and uneven. My entire body trembled with anticipation, fear, and something else I couldn't name, the dangerous thrill of standing on the edge of revelation. The cemetery was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes every sound unbearable, every rustle of leaves a thunderclap. Minutes crawled into hours, the sky bleeding from gold into navy, the first stars winking through the dusk. I sat frozen in the darkness, every muscle aching from stillness, my ears straining for footsteps. Nothing came. My eyelids grew heavy, doubt pressing in. Maybe no one would come tonight. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe this mystery was destined to remain hidden forever. And then, at last, I heard it. The faint crunch of shoes against gravel. My body went rigid, every nerve sparking awake. Slowly, carefully, I leaned forward, peering around the tree trunk. In the dim glow of the moonlight, I saw a figure approaching. They moved cautiously, their head turning side to side as if checking the shadows, as if they, too, carried secrets they didn't want revealed. My heart slammed so hard in my chest I thought the sound alone might give me away. The figure reached the grave and paused. For a long moment they stood there, silent, staring down at the folded paper I had left. My throat constricted, my breath caught, and my vision blurred with tears I couldn't control. Whoever this was, they were real, flesh and bone, not a ghost, not a dream, not an echo of my mother's voice, but a person standing just feet away from me, holding the answers I had been desperate for. Slowly, they bent down, their hand trembling slightly as they picked up the note. My body tensed, my fingers digging into the bark of the tree as if anchoring myself to reality. I watched as they unfolded the paper, their shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath. They pulled something from their coat, a pen, perhaps, and began to write, their movements quick but deliberate, time distorted in that moment. Every second felt like an eternity, every detail burned into my memory, the faint rustle of fabric as they shifted, the glint of the pen under the moonlight, the curve of their shoulders as they bent closer to the stone. I wanted to move, to step out of the shadows, to shout, "Who are you?" but my legs were lead, my voice locked in my throat. Fear and curiosity battled within me, each one threatening to tear me apart. When they finally straightened, folding the paper once more and placing it back at the headstone, my chest tightened so sharply it felt like my ribs might crack. This was my chance. My only chance. I leaned forward, my breath quickening, my mind screaming at me to step out before it was too late. But then, as though some invisible thread connected us, the figure paused. Slowly, deliberately, they turned their head, and their eyes scanned the darkness around them. In that instant, the world stopped. Their gaze locked on the shadow where I crouched. The figure noticed me and turned. Sometimes the answer to your prayers comes from the person you least expect. When the figure turned toward me, the air seemed to collapse in on itself. For a second, I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't move. My body screamed at me to run, but my heart was anchored to the ground. The figure's eyes, faintly lit by the sliver of moonlight, found the shadow where I hid. I froze, hoping the darkness would cloak me, but it was too late. They had seen me. "Who's there?" the voice called out, low and uncertain, not harsh but cautious. Every muscle in my body quivered. This was the moment I had dreaded and longed for all at once. Slowly, my legs carried me out from behind the tree, my breath ragged, my heart hammering so loudly it felt like the whole cemetery must hear it. As I stepped into the dim light, the figure straightened. The shape became clearer. It wasn't a stranger in the sense I had feared. It was someone I recognized. At first, my mind struggled to connect the dots, because recognition clashed violently with disbelief. It was Mrs. Reynolds, our neighbor from 2 streets over, the elderly woman who sometimes waved politely when she passed our house, who occasionally brought cookies around the holidays when my mom was still alive. She wasn't family. She wasn't someone I had confided in before. She was just there, a familiar presence at the edges of my life. "Mrs. Reynolds?" My voice cracked, equal parts shock and confusion. Her face softened in the pale light, her eyes shimmering with something I couldn't quite read, sorrow, perhaps, or guilt. She stepped closer, the lines on her face deepening as she spoke. "I thought I'd been careful," she murmured, almost to herself. "I didn't want you to see me." I stood, rooted to the ground, my hands trembling, my voice a whisper. "It was you? All this time? You're the one who's been writing back?" She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. Yes, it was me. The world spun. Relief, anger, gratitude, and betrayal all collided inside me. My knees felt weak, my throat raw. Why? Why would you do this?" Mrs. Reynolds sighed, her shoulders sagging as if under a weight she had carried far too long. "Because I couldn't stand to see you hurting. I would walk past the cemetery some evenings, and I saw the notes you left. At first, I thought they were just a way for you to cope, and I told myself I should leave them alone. But then one day, I read one. You had poured your heart out onto that paper, and I saw a child drowning in grief, invisible to everyone around her. I couldn't just stand by. Her words struck me like a blow. "So you pretended to be her?" I asked, tears spilling down my cheeks, my voice breaking. "I never pretended," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I never once wrote that I was your mother. I only wrote what I thought she might want you to hear. I wanted to give you something to hold on to. I wanted you to feel seen, because I knew what it was like to lose someone and feel like the world had turned its back." Her voice trembled then, her eyes glazing over with memories of her own. I had never thought much about Mrs. Reynolds before, but in that moment, I realized she carried her own grief. Her husband had died years ago, and she had no children of her own. She lived in that quiet little house on the corner, alone, her curtains always drawn. Maybe she saw herself in me. Maybe she recognized the loneliness I carried because she lived with her own. I wanted to hate her for it. I wanted to scream at her for stealing the intimacy of my letters, for inserting herself into a sacred space meant only for me and my mom. But I couldn't, because the truth was, her words had saved me. They had kept me from falling into despair, given me a reason to get up each morning, a reason to keep breathing. Her kindness had been real, even if her presence had been hidden. Still, my voice cracked with accusation. You knew things. Things you shouldn't have. The ribbon. The story about when I was sick. How could you have known those? Her face shifted then, a shadow passing over her features. She hesitated before answering, and my stomach twisted with anticipation. I knew your mother, she said softly. Better than you realize. We weren't just neighbors. We were friends, close friends. She used to talk to me about you all the time. She shared stories, memories, little details she cherished. I listened. I remembered. And when I saw the notes you were leaving, I thought maybe I could use those memories to give you back a piece of her, to remind you of the love she carried for you. The ground felt unsteady beneath me. My mother and Mrs. Reynolds' friends? I had never known. She had never mentioned it, not once. And yet, the pieces began to click together in my mind. The ribbon, the fever, the bedtime song. My mother had told her those things, confided in her, trusted her. That's how she knew. So all of it was true? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Those stories, they really happened? Yes, she said firmly, nodding. Every one of them. They weren't my inventions. They were hers. She loved you so fiercely, and she wanted the world to know every detail of who you were. I only repeated what she once told me. The tears that poured down my face were different this time. They weren't born entirely of pain, but of something softer, a bittersweet mixture of grief and relief. To know those words had been real. To know they had once come from my mother's lips, even if they now arrived through Mrs. Reynolds' hand gave me something I hadn't had in months, a sense of connection, however fragile. But still, the mystery deepened. Why hadn't my mother told me about this friendship? Why had Mrs. Reynolds kept it hidden until now? And what else did she know? I looked at her, my body trembling. You should have told me sooner. I know, she said, her eyes glistening. I was afraid. Afraid you'd be angry. Afraid you'd shut me out. Afraid I'd only make things worse. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not when I saw what you were going through. Silence stretched between us, heavy but not empty. For the first time, I saw her not as just the woman down the street, but as someone tied to my mother in ways I had never understood. Someone who had carried pieces of her that I never knew existed. She reached into her coat then, pulling out an envelope. My breath caught as she held it out to me. This one isn't from me, she said softly, her voice breaking. This is from your mom. She gave it to me before she passed, and she asked me to give it to you when the time was right. My hand shook violently as I reached for it, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a tidal wave. The envelope trembled in my hands, and on the front, written in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "For my daughter." What if the words you needed most had been waiting for you all along? The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as though the weight of my entire world had been sealed inside it. My fingers trembled as I held it, staring at the front where my mother's handwriting curved in familiar loops that I hadn't seen in months. For my daughter. Just 3 words, but they cut straight through me. My vision blurred, and I pressed the envelope against my chest, fighting back the sob that rose in my throat. This wasn't someone else's imitation, wasn't a memory retold by another voice. This was hers. Her hand had touched this paper, her pen had pressed into it, her love had poured out in the shape of every letter. Mrs. Reynolds stood silently a few feet away, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush me. She didn't speak. She seemed to understand that this was a moment that belonged to me alone. The wind rustled the trees overhead, carrying the faint smell of damp earth, and the world around me felt suspended, as if even time was holding its breath. With hands shaking so violently I could barely control them, I slid my finger under the seal and tore it open. Inside was a folded piece of lined stationery, creased at the edges, the ink slightly faded but still perfectly legible. I unfolded it slowly, terrified and desperate at the same time, and began to read. "My sweet girl," it began, and just seeing those words in her handwriting made my knees buckle. I sank onto the damp grass beside the headstone, the letter trembling in my hands. If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you the way I want to be. Writing these words is the hardest thing I have ever done, because it means imagining a world where I cannot hold you, cannot kiss your forehead, cannot whisper good night as you drift to sleep. But even if I am gone, I need you to know this. You will never be without me. Tears blurred the ink as I read, my breath shallow, my chest aching. Every sentence felt like she was speaking directly into my ear, as though the distance between us had collapsed and her voice had been captured in the curves of her script. You have always been my joy, my reason, my greatest treasure. From the moment I first held you in my arms, I knew my life would never belong only to me again. It would belong to you. I saw strength in you even as a child, the kind of strength that shines brightest in darkness. I know you don't believe that now, but one day, you will. I pressed the letter against my lips, inhaling the faint scent of old paper, imagining it carried traces of her. My heart screamed for her, begged for her touch, but these words, these fragile words were all I had left, and I clung to them as if they were oxygen. I worry that you will think my leaving means I abandoned you. Please believe me. Nothing could be further from the truth. I fought to stay. I wanted more time, more mornings, more stories, more laughter. But life doesn't always give us what we want. Sometimes it takes, and we can't stop it. What we can do is choose what remains. And what remains, my love, is you. You will carry me forward in every step you take, every kindness you offer, every dream you dare to chase. My tears fell freely now, dripping onto the paper and smudging the ink. I could almost see her face as I read the way she looked at me when she brushed my hair back from my forehead, the way her eyes softened when she whispered encouragement I didn't think I deserved. Every word she had written wrapped around me like a blanket, both comforting and unbearable, because it was proof of her love but also proof of her absence. The letter continued. I know the world can be cruel. I know there will be days when you feel invisible, when you believe you are not enough, when grief swallows you whole. But listen to me, my girl. You are more than enough. You are seen. You are loved. You are the best part of me, and nothing, not even death, can change that. I clutched the paper so tightly it crinkled in my hands. Her words were alive. They pulsed with her essence, her spirit, her truth. It felt like she was reaching out across time, grasping me by the shoulders, begging me to believe in myself even when I couldn't. You will stumble, you will doubt, you will hurt, but you will also rise. You will find joy again. You will laugh, even when you think laughter has left you forever. And when that day comes, don't feel guilty. Don't think you are betraying me by being happy. My greatest wish is for you to live fully, bravely, beautifully, carrying me in your heart but never chaining yourself to my absence. I sobbed openly now, my body shaking with grief and gratitude all at once. Her words weren't just comforting, they were commanding me to live. They were giving me permission to move forward, to believe that even in loss there could be life. The letter grew softer as it neared the end, the sentences shorter, more intimate, as though she had written them with tears of her own staining the page. When you miss me, write to me. Speak to me. I will find a way to answer. Maybe not in the ways you expect, but in ways you will feel if you are willing to listen. Love never leaves. It only changes shape. I lowered the paper for a moment, staring at those words through blurred eyes. Was this what had been happening? Had she, in some way, answered? Or had others carried her love forward for her? The thought rattled me, left me trembling with both wonder and doubt. Finally, I forced myself to read the closing lines, my heart pounding as if bracing for impact. One day, you'll understand. When the time is right, the pieces will come together, and you will see the truth that is bigger than both of us. Until then, hold on to my words, hold on to my love, and know that I am never far from you, always and forever, Mom. My breath left me in a shudder. The letter slipped slightly in my grip as the weight of those final words crashed down. One day, you'll understand. The phrase rang in my ears, unsettling and cryptic, as though she were hinting at something more, something hidden, something I had yet to discover. I sat in the cemetery, the letter trembling in my hands, my heart torn between comfort and confusion. Her words had given me the solace I had craved, but they had also left me with a mystery that burned hotter than ever. The letter ended not with closure, but with a riddle. One day, you'll understand. Love sometimes leaves behind more than memories, it leaves unfinished stories. After reading my mother's letter, I felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because her words gave me the comfort I had been starved of for so long. Heavier because of that one cryptic sentence that clung to my mind like a shadow. One day, you'll understand. What was I supposed to understand? What pieces were meant to come together? And why did she write it as if there was something waiting for me beyond her death? Mrs. Reynolds watched me closely as I folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, my hands trembling as though I were holding a living thing. She didn't press me to speak, didn't interrupt my grief, but there was something in her expression that told me she hadn't given me everything yet. What does it mean? I whispered, staring at the words again. Her lips pressed together, as if she were weighing a decision she'd been avoiding for a long time. Finally, she sighed. There's more, she said softly. Your mother didn't leave just this letter. She left something else. Something she wanted you to have when you were ready. My breath caught. Something else. What do you mean? She gave me instructions before she passed, Mrs. Reynolds continued. She told me to hold on to certain things until the right moment. I wasn't sure when that would be, but after seeing how you've been reaching out to her, after watching you fight through this grief, I think it's time. Her words shook me to my core. My mother had prepared more than one goodbye. She had left behind pieces of herself, hidden and waiting, like breadcrumbs leading me toward some greater truth. A mix of dread and anticipation surged inside me. Together, Mrs. Reynolds and I returned to her house. It felt strange stepping into her living room, a place I had only ever glimpsed from the outside. Yet now it held the promise of my mother's unfinished story. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Dust motes floated in the shafts of fading sunlight as she led me toward the attic stairs. The attic groaned as we climbed, the wooden boards beneath our feet creaking with every step. The air grew thicker, tinged with the scent of cedar and old fabric. When we reached the top, she flicked on a dim bulb that swayed from the ceiling, casting trembling shadows across boxes stacked high and trunks lined against the walls. She moved carefully, scanning the labels as if she knew exactly what she was searching for. My heart thudded louder with every passing second, until finally she stopped in front of a weathered trunk, pushed against the far wall. Her fingers brushed the lid reverently before she looked back at me. "This is it," she said quietly. I crouched beside her, my chest tight, my throat dry. The trunk creaked as she lifted the lid, revealing neatly stacked boxes, old photo albums, and envelopes bundled with string. My mother's handwriting was scrawled across many of them recipes, notes, letters, addressed to people I didn't recognize. I reached out and touched one of the albums, my hands trembling at the familiar loops of her pen. But then Mrs. Reynolds pulled out a smaller box from the bottom of the trunk. It was wooden, polished but worn with age, and on the lid, in faded gold paint, was my name. My breath hitched so sharply it hurt. I reached for it, my fingertips grazing the smooth surface. It wasn't heavy, but it carried a weight that felt immeasurable. My name, written there by her hand, made my vision blur with tears. This wasn't just a keepsake. This was something she had prepared specifically for me, something she had wanted me to find after she was gone. My throat tightened as I whispered, "Why didn't she tell me about this?" "Because she wanted you to be ready," Mrs. Reynolds said gently. "She wanted you to reach this moment yourself." I sat there on the dusty attic floor, the box trembling in my hands. Memories of my mother rushed through me, her laughter, her cooking, her bedtime stories, her quiet strength. And now, even after her death, she had reached forward in time to place this box in my lap. It was almost too much to bear. With shaking hands, I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for a latch. There was one, small and brass, but it was locked. My stomach dropped. "There's a key," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice calm. She reached into the trunk again and pulled out a small envelope. Written across the front, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "For when she's ready." My tears fell freely as I took it from her. Inside was a tiny, delicate key, tied to a piece of ribbon, not just any ribbon, but a familiar faded blue one. The ribbon, the same ribbon my mother had worn in her hair, the same one described in the letters. I pressed it to my face, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered after all these years. The key trembled in my hand as I leaned forward and slid it into the lock. My chest tightened, my pulse thundering. This was it, the secret she had left behind, the truth waiting to be uncovered. I hesitated for a moment, terrified of what I might find. What if it was nothing but trinkets, simple objects with no meaning beyond sentiment? Or worse, what if it contained answers I wasn't ready for? What if, "One day, you'll understand," was not a promise, but a warning? Mrs. Reynolds placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Whatever is inside," she said softly, "remember it's hers. She wanted you to have it." I nodded, swallowing hard. Slowly, I turned the key. The latch clicked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the attic. I lifted the lid. The box opened. Inside, nestled carefully on a bed of soft fabric, was something that made me gasp so loudly the sound filled the attic and bounced back at me. My mother's hidden secret lay before me, and it was nothing I could have ever imagined. Healing doesn't come when pain disappears, it comes when pain finally makes sense. The gasp that left my lips when I opened the box felt torn from the deepest part of me. My hands hovered over the contents, trembling so badly that the objects inside seemed to blur. Nestled in the soft fabric were keepsakes, each one carefully chosen, each one humming with my mother's presence as though she had placed them there only yesterday. The first thing I touched was a diary. Its leather cover was worn, the corners frayed, the kumpel ohm, pages yellowed slightly with age. My breath caught as I lifted it, pressing it against my chest. I had never known my mother to keep a diary, but here it was, filled with her voice locked into every page. My fingers shook as I opened it to the first entry, dated years before I was even born. "I don't know if anyone will ever read this," she had written, "but I need to put my thoughts somewhere. Today I found out I am pregnant. I'm terrified and overjoyed all at once. I don't know how I'll manage, but I know one thing. This child will never doubt they are loved." Tears slid down my cheeks as I turned the pages. Entry after entry revealed pieces of her I had never seen, her fears, her sacrifices, her private moments of doubt, and the unshakable devotion that always brought her back to one truth: me. She wrote about sleepless nights, about working double shifts to make ends meet, about the loneliness she sometimes felt when the world grew heavy. But every page circled back to love. Every entry ended with some version of the same vow: no matter how hard it gets, I will keep going for you. I pressed my hand against the ink, wishing I could touch her through it, aching for the sound of her voice. And then, almost as if she had anticipated that very longing, I found a small cassette tape tucked between the pages. My chest tightened. Scrawled across the label, in her unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For my daughter." Mrs. Reynolds helped me find an old tape player from the attic. With trembling fingers, I slid the cassette inside and pressed play. For a moment there was static, a faint hiss that made my heart pound with anticipation. And then, her voice. "Hi, sweetheart." I collapsed into tears the second I heard it. It was her alive, warm, real. Her voice filled the attic, wrapping around me like a blanket I thought I'd lost forever. "If you're listening to this," she continued, "it means I couldn't stay as long as I wanted. I'm so sorry for that. But I don't want you to only remember the pain of me leaving. I want you to remember how much I loved living with you. Every giggle, every bedtime story, every morning when you woke me up too early, those were my favorite moments in this world. You made my life worth everything." I pressed my hands against my mouth, trying to contain the sobs. Hearing her voice again was like being split open and healed at the same time. "There will be days when you feel like you can't go on," she said, her voice faltering just slightly, as though she had been crying too when she recorded it. "But I need you to promise me that you will try. Live your life bravely. Don't let my absence steal your future. Carry me with you, but don't let me hold you back. You were meant for more than sorrow, my love. You were meant to shine." The tape clicked off after a few more words of love, and silence fell heavy in the attic. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the diary in one hand and the tape in the other, feeling her presence in a way I hadn't since the day she left this world. For the first time, the ache of grief shifted into something different, not gone, but changed, softened by the certainty of her love. I went through the rest of the box, slowly, reverently. There were photographs of us together, some I remembered, others I had never seen. There was a bracelet she used to wear, one I had always admired but never touched. There was even a small note, folded and tucked into the corner, with just 4 words written on it. "You are my heart." Piece by piece, her story unfolded before me, not just as my mother, but as a woman who had lived, fought, loved, and sacrificed more than I ever understood. For so long, I had thought of her absence as the end of everything. But through these keepsakes, I began to see that it wasn't the end at all. It was a continuation, a way for her to guide me, even when she couldn't stand beside me. The pain didn't vanish, but it began to make sense. Every lonely night, every unanswered question, every ache in my chest, it all led me here, to this box, to this revelation that love doesn't disappear with death. It transforms, it leaves traces, it finds ways to reach us even in the darkest places. I felt a strength rise in me that I hadn't known was possible. It wasn't the kind of strength that erased pain, but the kind that carried it with dignity, the kind that allowed me to breathe again without guilt. My mother had prepared me for this, not to replace her, but to remind me that she had never truly left. For the first time, I could imagine a future where I wasn't crushed by grief, but fueled by it. A future where I honored her not by mourning endlessly, but by living fully. I closed the diary gently, placed the tape back in its case, and whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, Mom." It felt like a prayer. It felt like a promise. "Mrs." Reynolds rested a hand on my shoulder, her eyes glistening with tears of her own. "She would be so proud of you," she said softly. For the first time in months, I believed it. And yet, just as the weight of grief began to lift, just as I started to feel whole again, something unexpected shattered the fragile peace. Because that very night, as I prepared to hide the box safely under my bed, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, someone I hadn't seen in years was standing there, and my entire world. Sometimes the last letter isn't goodbye, it's the start of forever. After the knock on the door that night, and the unexpected return of someone from my past, my world shifted again. But this time, instead of breaking me, it expanded me. It was as though grief had been a cage, and with every discovery, the letters, the diary, the cassette tape, a bar had been bent until, at last, I could step out into a wider life. But freedom wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing to live with what remained. For days, I carried my mother's keepsakes with me like sacred relics. The diary lay open on my nightstand, a ribbon tucked into my favorite entry, the one where she described holding me for the first time. The cassette tape sat in a drawer, but I played it often, just to hear her voice fill the room like sunlight. The photos were tucked into the frame of my mirror, so every morning when I woke, I saw her smiling at me. Each item was a piece of her, proof that love lingers even when life doesn't. And yet, despite the comfort they brought, I felt something restless inside me. The box had given me strength, but strength begs to be used. My mother hadn't left me these things so I could live buried in memories. She had left them so I could step forward, carrying her voice with me but not drowning in her absence. So I began to write again. At first, it felt strange to put pen to paper without expecting an answer. My hand hesitated, hovering over the page, as if the act of writing would be meaningless without a reply. But then I remembered her words from the letter. When you miss me, write to me. Speak to me. I will find a way to answer. Maybe not in the ways you expect, but in ways you will feel if you are willing to listen. And so I wrote. Not to be answered, not to be comforted, but to heal. I wrote about the pain that still rose in waves, about the strength I had begun to find, about the hope I was learning to trust again. I wrote about the future, the things I wanted to do, the life I wanted to build, the way I wanted to carry her love forward into everything I became. Each letter I wrote felt like laying a brick on a path that stretched before me, guiding me out of the shadows and into something brighter. They weren't desperate anymore. They weren't pleas thrown into the void. They were conversations with myself, reflections of the girl I had been and the woman I was becoming. Sometimes, I still left the notes and at her grave. Not because I expected them to vanish or return with an answer, but because it felt right. It felt like keeping the ritual alive, a gesture of love that didn't need a reply to matter. The cemetery no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a place of connection, of remembrance, of beginnings hidden inside endings. One afternoon, as the sky turned golden with the last stretch of sunlight, I wrote what I knew would be my final letter. Not final in the sense of closure, because grief doesn't close. Final in the sense of release. The words came easily this time. Thank you, I wrote, for loving me, for leaving me strength when I thought I had none, for teaching me that even in the darkest silence, I can still hear your voice if I listen closely enough. I will carry you with me, always. This isn't goodbye. It's just the next step. I folded the note with steady hands and placed it at the base of her headstone, smoothing the paper against the cold stone. Then I whispered the words aloud into the breeze. Thank you, Mom. For the first time in months, my chest didn't ache with emptiness. It ached with fullness, with gratitude, with love that stretched beyond life and death. I turned and walked away, not with the heaviness of despair, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew they could endure. Days passed. I didn't return to the cemetery immediately, because I no longer needed to. I was learning to live outside its gates, to laugh again without guilt, to dream without fear of betrayal. The world looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. But one evening, a restlessness tugged at me, a quiet pull I couldn't ignore. Something urged me back to her grave, as though the earth itself was whispering that there was still one more step to take. I went at sunset, the sky painted in streaks of pink and violet, the air cool against my skin. As I approached, my breath caught in my throat, because the note I had left days ago was no longer where I placed it. Instead, there was a new one, folded neatly, waiting for me. My pulse thundered as I crouched down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The paper was different from mine, heavier, the edges crisp. My heart pounded so hard it hurt as I unfolded it. Inside were only 4 words. You're not alone anymore. My breath hitched, my vision blurred. It wasn't my mother's handwriting. It wasn't Mrs. Reynolds either. It was someone new, someone unknown. I stared at the words, my body frozen between terror and wonder. The story I thought had ended was beginning again. The story wasn't over because a new voice had answered, shifted all over again. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, what do you think that final note means? Don't forget to like this video if you felt connected, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story waiting in the silence. Your support is what keeps these stories alive, and together we'll uncover even more hidden voices.